So I'd first like to thank you all for joining us today and taking the time out of your very busy schedules, I'm sure, to be with us, especially those who lost loved ones in this tragedy. It's really important, and we're really thankful that you're here today. So it's my pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Dr. Sherene Razack. So Dr. Razack will speak for approximately 45 minutes, and then we just ask that you hold your questions until the end, and we'll have a question period where we can all discuss. So Dr. Razack is a distinguished professor of critical race, gender, and citizenship studies in education. She teaches in the Department of Social Justice Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. Her research focuses on race, gender, and law, as well as citizenship in Canada. She interrogates how constructions of gender and race operate in the settler colonial state. Dr. Razack is also the founding member of Researchers and Academics of Color for Equality. Some of her most recent publications include Dying from Improvement, Inquests and Inquiries into Indigenous Deaths in Custody, Casting Out, Race and the Eviction of Muslims from Western Law, and Dark Threats and White Nights, The Somalia Affair, Peacekeeping and the New Imperialism. She's also co-edited The Limits to Justice, Women of Color on Terror, and States of Race, Critical Race Feminism for the 21st Century. So if you'll please help me give Dr. Razack a warm welcome.
Thanks very much for the invitation, Chandrima, especially. This is really difficult work that you're doing to organize, and I'm really pleased that you invited me to talk about racism. And I really would like to thank Jesse and all the students and the army of faculty that it takes to put on an event like this. I have put them on myself, and I know that it takes a good part of your academic year. So it's also been really wonderful to be treated with such courtesy. It's rare. So thank you. I was listening to the presentations and the keynotes and thinking, oh my God, what an impossible spot to be getting up here and trying to talk about racism in Canada after so much grief, so much reflection on these memories. It is very difficult, but at the same time, I think most of us here are clear that we have to always go beyond grief to politics. And very central to the grief, at least in the stories that we have been hearing, is a consciousness of that moment in 1985, both what preceded it and what happened after, right up until the present day. Those are moments that include a lot of what I like to call an eviction from the nation. Those are moments when it becomes clear that it is very hard to feel oneself as fully a part of the nation. Evictions, for example, such as that day in Cork, where no Canadian official showed up, as Dr. Gupta narrated, or the days preceding, when the threat assessment was completely off and low. These evictions are moments that bind the victims with the rest of us. They're evictions that are collectively shared, because what they amount to is something we call racism, which it's not a very useful word sometimes, because it doesn't seem to capture what is really happening. It especially doesn't capture it when sometimes we need to call it annihilation or death. So my premise is that, and I'm saying brown people, it's become, have you noticed, it's no longer fashionable to talk about brown people. It's funny, there was a period there when it was okay, but now it seems to be not okay. And I myself am not sure if I want to talk about anti-brown racism. It might sound as though it's a kind of almost an appropriation, like getting too close to anti-black racism. But what I mean when I say that this condition that so many of us share that brown people share is a condition we call racism. It is a condition that is very specific to a place and time. And, you know, if it's anything this conference has really emphasized, we have to be really careful when we think about what we share and don't share. I think it's, you know, when we had the keynote on trauma, it's clear that it's very easy to appropriate pain, to steal pain, and to do something with it that is not for you to do. And I'm really conscious of that. But, you know, at the same time, I kept asking myself yesterday more than I ever had before, my family did not die on that aircraft. And yet, I feel as though my family did. And so I've been wrestling with those things, as I'm sure so many of you are, and asking myself, what is the connection? And how can I talk about that connection that is not about appropriating pain? So I thought, you know, well, there's some kind of biological connection which one feels immediately as you walk into the room, a kind of connection that's worn on the skin or the hair. I don't know if it's the fact that so many of the men here look like my father or my brothers. I don't know if the women here, you know, they look like my sisters. Is this the connection? Is this what makes it family? And that really unsettles me because, you know, I'm a scholar of racism and I'm really worried about biology being the basis of anything. But still I feel the connection. There is, of course, the matter of shared origins. However long ago, many of us have origins on the Indian subcontinent. I, for example, I'm from Trinidad, and I am the descendant of indentured workers who left that subcontinent 150 years ago and made their way to the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. This is, as Amber said yesterday, it's a wonderful phrase, this is a transatlantic community forged in colonialism. And I think at least one of the connections that we have is that we are that community forged across spaces and time in colonialism. And it's a community that continues to be forged in the fires of colonialism. We are on stolen land, and the fields we have come to work in this land are now not literally sugarcane fields, but they are fields that are claimed by Europeans. Far from making us innocent in this picture, it just implicates us. We are caught in a project. As Fanon said so long ago, it's a project of accumulation, but it proceeds along racial lines. Whose lives have value and whose lives don't. So today, when I talk about anti-brown racism, I really want to talk about navigating those fields and perhaps remember the connections from when we plowed them or planted them. And now we no longer do that. And I want to try to get to politics. I thought I would begin by raising a few of the points I tried to raise at the inquiry. Many of you probably know that I was asked to prepare a paper on what racism had to do with the bombings, both before and after. And this was on behalf of the families. And, you know, I have to tell you, as you would no doubt guess, it takes quite a lot to explain racism at the inquiry. The hostility was extraordinary. There was a sort of outrageous and very callous kind of disrespect. It wasn't personal, even if it's experienced personally. It was disrespect for anybody who dared to say that there was racism. And of course, ultimately, the ultimate eviction from the nation is when racism is absolutely ruled out of bounds as having nothing to do with the inquiry at all. That day on the stand, and maybe I think some of you were definitely there, I remember sort of facing this barrage of what later on I would try to say were simply stupid questions, but they were not stupid questions. They were darts, they were guns aimed at, making sure that it was not possible to make a statement like racism had something to do with the inquiry. So that day on the stand, I really felt the full force of the state. And I do remember looking down and looking at the faces of family members and reminding myself that what was aimed at them was nothing compared to what was being aimed at me. But clearly it was linked. And what I was being told that day was a lesson not only for me, but for anybody who dared to say what I was trying to say. And essentially what I was being told is, this is a line that you must not cross. You cannot say these words, racism. It will give offense, and it will cause your eviction from the nation. And I said to a few people today, I've often thought about trying to write about those moments in Canadian law when racism is mentioned, and then you see the darts come out, and the punishment swiftly follows. So it's quite a task to explain racism, and of course you stay up all night thinking, if you could have done a better job, would they have got it? Is there some way to say it that would make them get it? And I torment myself endlessly about that. But I think I want to just quickly sort of note for the record a few things that I really feel we ought to keep in mind as we have this discussion about what anti-brown racism might look like today. The first thing to keep in mind, and several people have said it, is that Canada is a white settler society, and there's no getting around that, even if the Crown attorney asked me whether it was me and a few of my friends who dreamt up this idea that this was a colonial project. I mean, could you actually say that to an Indigenous person? So this is a society that is established by Europeans on non-European soil. And it requires the dispossession of Indigenous peoples. It requires the ongoing dispossession. It isn't over yet. The land is still being stolen. The resources and the minerals are still being stolen, and it is still taking an extraordinary amount of Indigenous death to do it. So that's the first thing that I think we have to keep in mind. The second thing is that in the settler story, which is the story that the land was empty and we came and, developed it because the people who were living here didn't really know what to do with it. In that story, white people are the bearers of civilization. It is they who have civilization. And in that story, people of color are seen as late arrivals who got here after it was all done. And this has great significance. The Chinese who built the railway, or the Sikhs who built the lumber industry, or all our communities' labors over the years, these things are forgotten in this story of European achievement and accomplishment. And there is a very important consequence to being scripted as the late arrival. And the consequence is it will never be your country. It's somebody else's that you have entered, and you will have the responsibilities and the limited rights of guests. So it's a manifestly racial story where, as Hamani Banerjee once poetically put it, Canadians of color are simply stains on the landscape, on the snowy landscape. This is a settler story of origins that really has material impact, and you only have to look at all the laws around refugees and immigrants and so on to see the impact. And for those of you thinking of political economy, you only have to look at, the place of people of color in the labor force and so on. The important thing is that European Canadians or white Canadians come to know themselves in this settler story as rights-bearing citizens against Indigenous and racial citizens, and that's the important thing. So in the national imaginary, Canadians are taught to imagine themselves as an enterprising people, a peacekeeping nation, largely uninvolved in the world's crises. We've had several prime ministers who have simply denied that there is colonialism. Michael Ignatieff, for his brief moment in the sun, said that, the land was peacefully settled. So Canadians are taught in a variety of places that they are an innocent people from the land of clean snow, as one of the commissioners of the Somalia inquiry put it. And they must go out to help clean up the messes that chaotic, tribal, and underdeveloped third world peoples make for themselves. Canadians are not taught to imagine themselves as implicated in the global crises of the world. So, for example, our children don't learn very much in school about our activities in mining, which destroys the lives of several communities in several countries, destabilizing parts of Africa and Latin America quite significantly. If immigrants come to Canadian shores, they are seen as merely seeking a better place to live in one of the nicest countries on earth. And we don't pause very much to ask questions about what drives people to immigrate. It is common to find the view that one found in Canadian newspapers in 1985 in response to the Air India bombings, and here I'm going to quote a columnist: "Canada as a nation has been studiously uninvolved and disengaged from the blood feuds of these several murderous factions." The important point here is that while Canada is made as innocent, the rest of us have to be scripted as the murderous blood feuds. And that analytical line will regulate our lives at every site. So violence becomes a property of third world cultures and nations, and not a product of social, historical, and political factors. So it was very easy in 1985 particularly, but also easy today, to believe the simple explanation that terrorist acts are born of inherently violent cultures. We're doing it now with Muslims. If one's position in the world, one's understanding of oneself, requires the subordination of others, then racism will not only be a problem of misinformation or ignorance. It'll be something much bigger and therefore much more difficult to dislodge. I remember trying to think about an easy way to explain systemic racism to the inquiry, and I tried to turn to the Commission on Systemic Racism that had produced, had reflected a lot on this problem. And I quoted my friend Tony Williams, who was the commissioner, and she said, essentially she painted a picture that social institutions kind of inculcate ideas about the legitimacy of a social order. Those are her words. And so you get sort of decision makers who are responsible for maintaining that social order, and they are essentially of one group, a homogenous group, and they don't interact very much with people not like themselves. And so institutions then begin to kind of reproduce the story that I just told you about. And I used that in my report at the inquiry, but all the while thinking, no, Tony, this is not the main problem. It's not that they don't know any people of color to talk to, or that we're not there in these positions, or that the RCMP doesn't have enough people of color. Is that the real problem? The real problem is that we're in a racial structure where people of color are consigned to a particular role, both materially and symbolically, and most important of all, European Canadians or white Canadians absolutely must believe in that role if they are to know themselves. And that is the part that is really difficult. So we see the professionals associated with threat assessment and with post-bombing responses conducting their everyday lives in ways that required dismissing people of color as the same kind of people as themselves. So it's not that they didn't really know about religious customs or the ordinary everyday rules of compassion and courtesy. It is that these are the things that you have to believe if you are wedded to an idea of yourself as superior. And I really want to emphasize this point because what I'm talking about today is what I call the pedagogy of citizenship. I want to focus on how not just European Canadians, but in fact all of us come to learn to take our place in this racially ordered society. How do we come to learn who belongs where? This is the matter that I think is so important. And this pedagogy has many sites. We learn it in schools, we learn it in the media, we learn it from the law. When John Major writes a report that says there's no racism here and he's absolutely insulted that there's no racism here, the rest of us all must learn that there is no racism here and that people who say there is racism are crazy. So we learn it at many, many sites, and that is why I sort of made the decision today, not made very easily, to in fact devote the bulk of my talk not to the Air India inquiry, not to the bombings and the period following. I really want to devote my talk to another moment of racism in order to drive home the point that we are in a structure and that we need to determine how this structure works in order to interrupt it. There have been many people saying in a very heartfelt way that what happened to that plane and what happened to the families afterwards should never happen again. Several people said it should never happen to anybody else. This shouldn't go on. We all want to interrupt it, but what is the it that we want to interrupt? We really have to think seriously about that. And that's why I chose today to use an example that maybe some consider a little bit provocative. I want to turn to how Muslims have been evicted from the nation in order to ask you to think about the eviction that happened with respect to Air India and the bombings, and think about the connections between them. Think about whether or not there is a broader description of racism that we must in the end use. Now, I don't want to deny that there are specificities to different kinds of racism. Anti-black racism is not like anti-brown racism. One feature of anti-black racism is that black people are not humans at all, not merely underdeveloped. I also don't want to say that all the racism that comes at brown people is the same thing, because it varies, it's very specific. There is anti-Muslim racism, and it's very different. Note that I didn't say bigger or better or worse. It's just different, and we need to focus on these specificities. I don't want to engage in the process of comparison of these racisms simply because it would take the rest of my academic life to actually do that. So what I want to do today is simply trace a kind of race line that runs through what happened to Omar Khadr in order to invite you to think about what happened to Indo-Canadians with respect to Air India. There is a little bit of method to my madness, because the question of Muslims is very intricately linked to the question of terrorism. And this is also something that runs through responses to Air India. And there is a very strong impulse to say that what is happening to Muslims has something to do with religion and not with race. And so I really want to put it on the table in order that we force ourselves to think critically about it when everything around us is inviting us not to on this particular issue. Someone mentioned, I think, in one of the questions that I think when Sushil Gupta said no other Canadian should have to suffer, and someone said prevention is a kind of murky area. It is murky if you don't think through how racism is organized. You could sometimes end up, in the interests of pursuing your own goals, contributing to racism, against another group. Shortly after the inquiry happened, the Air India inquiry, on July 15, 2008, some of you may remember, but it's interesting who remembers, Canadians watched on the national news a few minutes of a 2003 four-day interrogation of Omar Khadr at Guantanamo Bay by CSIS. The Supreme Court had ordered the videotape to be released, and Khadr's legal team had fought for it because they assumed, wrongly as it turned out, that if we all saw it, we would be outraged, that we would not stand for a 16-year-old to be so interrogated and in effect see the effects of torture. So we all saw it if you watched your national news that day, and it replayed endlessly. On day one, as the interrogation begins, we see a young boy whose face lights up when he sees the CSIS agents, who begin very happily and genially saying, "I guess we're the first Canadians you've seen in a while." And Omar Khadr smiles because he has not seen his country's representatives for the entire time that he's been incarcerated. So it is the first Canadians he's seen. He says, "I've been requesting to see you for a while." By day two, Omar Khadr realizes that CSIS is not there to help him. They are not his consular representatives at all. In fact, they're there to interrogate him. The 16-year-old told his Canadian interrogators that he had been tortured, and he asked them to protect him from the Americans. He showed them his wounds. Australian scholar Joseph Pugliese has written of this moment in this interrogation because, of course, the rest of the world saw this interrogation too, and not everybody reacted without emotion, as the Canadian public generally did. And Pugliese said, "You see in this scene the victim of torture who experiences his body as fragmented and lost. And you see the interrogator indifferent to the suffering youth. The interrogator is insisting there has been no harm. When the interrogators leave the room for a minute, we see on the camera a young boy crying out in Arabic for his mother and sobbing uncontrollably." Pugliese says to us, Khadr's cries have simply become absorbed into a legal black hole of unrelieved trauma and affliction. Yet it is through that interrogation and other moments that Canadians would come to learn that Khadr had been subjected to the torture of sleep deprivation for long hours. He was used as a human mop to wipe up his own urine. He was shackled and bound in stress positions. He was psychologically tortured, threatened with rape, threatened with the possibility of never returning to Canada. And all of this began at 15, when he was a minor. And you all know the story and how it has ended up. The point of all of this is that throughout this entire process, Canadians expressed very little outrage upon viewing the videotape of the interrogation. When details surfaced that cast really strong doubt on the US claim that Khadr had thrown a grenade that killed an American medic, there was still no sympathy for Khadr. All of this is a bit puzzling, not only because he was a child, but because he was of the West, technically speaking. All other Western countries had repatriated their citizens from Guantanamo. Our country fought to keep him there. Polls consistently reported that 81% of Canadians were unhappy that Khadr has was back in Canada. I don't know what that percentage is now, but my point is Khadr was hardly ever for more than a moment seen as a member of this nation, even a child. Canadian responses to Khadr have been along two lines, both of which may be characterized as blood narratives. Each storyline, although they had contradictory goals, really relied on this idea that values are somehow innate and carried in the blood. And when I think about this, I return to Hannah Arendt's notion of race thinking. What is race thinking? People ask that all the time. What is race thinking? Race thinking is a structure of thought that divides up the world between the deserving and the undeserving according to descent, according to blood. Values are seen as inheritable traits in race thinking. So the first narrative line, and the one held by the government of Stephen Harper, is that Khadr is a terrorist. Terrorists never change. He belongs to a race of people, Muslims, who carry the seeds of disloyalty, fanaticism, and violence in the blood. We can't do anything about it. That's who they are. Blood narratives also persist, though, in the opposite narrative that was meant to help Khadr, which is that we should help Khadr because he was a child soldier, and we should do that because innocent third world children need to be rescued by an enlightened West. This is a problem. The figure of the child has been of crucial importance to the West's construction of itself as humanitarian. Unfortunately, of course, with that line of argument, it's not going to work because Khadr cannot easily be seen as a child who is deserving of rescue. And the child soldier narrative has been the weaker position by far, even when people like Romeo Dallaire have said to Canadians, this is a child soldier, you save other child soldiers, why can't you save this one? It hasn't worked at all, either in Parliament or in the media. The reason it hasn't worked is because the child soldier narrative that we tell, we being Canada, requires a geographic as much as a racial difference. The child soldier cannot be of us. The child soldier is somebody in Sierra Leone, somebody in a barbaric situation whom we have to save. So we can reconcile ourselves to the cries of a boy locked up in Guantanamo through these kinds of narratives. The first one, the Harper line, is dependent on the figure of the Muslim as innately pre-modern and anti-modern. And we defend ourselves with the line that the natives understand only force. We can't deal with them any other way. We have to torture them. There's no other way to keep them in line. And the second line, we have to save the children of the third world, is also a blood narrative. And each of these narratives requires and makes an innocent, superior white subject. And so, how much time do I have till till 3 or 3:15? 3:15? Okay, so because I have this tendency to not get to the point until the end, then I have to rush through it, which is really awful. So I wanted to show you how these things unfolded in the political and the legal realm, because I believe that this same kind of performance, the same kind of racial line, the production of these same kinds of subjects is what we ought to be thinking about when we think about Air India. So when you start thinking about cultural values that are somehow genetic, you get into really strange water. In the Inquisition, for example, they believed that people who had been Christians for centuries but had once had Muslim or Jewish families still possibly carried the seeds of disloyalty in their blood. In fact, they even had a term for it, sort of stained blood, sangre empieza. And the Inquisition set out to figure out whether these people were exhibiting what their genetic heritage really said they should exhibit. And believe it or not, and I don't have the time to go through that today, but you can see this exact line of thinking in the security hearing, where Canadian courts insist that there's something hidden that you can't see that detainees are carrying. And this is the tendency to fanaticism. There was a paper earlier today on Precrime. You know, the idea that we need to arrest people who will commit a crime. It's not people who have committed a crime. And so in this sort of environment, legal environment, blood discourse is the idea that you could have some capacity for violence that is carried in your blood. A crazy idea in most environments is an idea that survives in Western courts where law has been abandoned. So where you have secret evidence, detention without charge, diminished standards of proof, all of those things, you also have an opportunity to tell really crazy racial stories that will somehow work, because no one will be able to put up their hand and say, you can't say that. I felt a little bit like that at the Air India inquiry, frankly, when, you know, I'm being asked a very stupid question, like, do I think there's colonialism in Canada? Why didn't anyone put up their hands and say, I don't think you could ask that? Or, you know, whether I was asked whether I should be better considered an activist instead of an academic. This after 30 years and 8 books. He's still asking me this question, are you an activist because you went to the World Conference Against Racism? I mean, those are moments, you know, why was that allowed to thrive? And you might listen to those moments and say, they're moments of racism. But there are also moments where this is allowed to happen in the structure. And that's what we should pay attention to. So Khadr was in such a structure. So there he is at Guantanamo, and he's being interrogated by the state's psychologist who is supposed to give evidence that he is beyond redemption and has to be sentenced for life because he carries these genes. What does the psychologist do? He relies on the work of Nikolai Sennels. If you know Nikolai Sennels, he is Danish. He says he's a researcher. He hasn't done that much research, but he runs around the world saying that Muslims have a genetic incapacity to be modern and to integrate. And this is the guy who is the witness relied on at Guantanamo. And so Khadr is asked questions, which he answers. So, for example, he's asked about his religious practices, and the psychologist concludes that because Khadr has learned the Quran and can actually recite it, that he's become more religious and therefore more dangerous. Khadr's response when asked, why did you learn the Quran? He said, well, there was nothing else to do. I didn't have any other books. Wellner concludes, this is the psychologist, that Khadr was, you know, not acculturated sufficiently and therefore was really showing his Muslimness too much. And the reason we know he was not acculturated was that one of the books he did manage to find was Harry Potter. He read that book. You would think that would make him a very typical teenager, because that's surely the best proof of acculturation that you could find. But in fact, it was simply proof that he lived in a fantasy world. So this is the kind of bizarre logic that attends to someone like Khadr. And these narratives that Wellner, circulated in the court actually circulate through the Canadian public as well. So, for example, the Harper government gave us its reason why it delayed Khadr's return to Canada was because it wanted to see every single word of this Wellner testimony. And all of that was circulated in Maclean's magazine, etc. So you could be forgiven, some of you, if you think to yourself that Khadr really is carrying the seeds of a dangerous fanaticism and violence in his blood, because that is the only story that you were ever given. That's the story that we see frame by frame by frame when we see sort of interviews with his mother and his sister, and what we see are these very apparently unfeeling women in niqab, and we can conclude that Muslims really are a pathological lot. The point that I want to make is that we are made to feel Muslim pathology, and through that, we begin to feel and believe in white civilizational superiority. And this story is not simply a story that unfolds on your evening news, although that is quite significant, or in Maclean's magazine, but a story that actually unfolds in parliamentary subcommittees, and they become the basis of law. And this is exactly what happened. So in the parliamentary subcommittee that took up the problem of the question of Khadr, we see it played over and over again. Jason Kenney arguing to that committee that not all child soldiers are equal. We cannot put Khadr in the same category that we can put Ismail Bier from Sierra Leone, who has killed many, many people, because Khadr is in fact a Muslim. It is clear that Khadr has no country, because no country is there to defend him. And when we look at the stories as it's repeated over and over again, we understand that it takes quite a lot of work to evict Khadr from the nation. It's actually not all that easily accomplished. He is, after all, a boy from Mississauga. And he doesn't conform to type. He doesn't do the things that the state would like him to do to be able to tell that story. And so Jason Kenney and others have to work really hard in the parliamentary subcommittee to actually convince all concerned that what we have here is somebody who is beyond redemption. And so here's how this plays out, and you may be very familiar to it. Maybe I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. So when Romeo Dallaire very heroically tries to argue that we ought to pay attention to civil liberties and to people's rights, and they don't have a right to be tortured, they should not be tortured, Jason Kenney says to him, so would you actually contest the fact that this category of people, that's how he considers Khadr, is responsible for things. And what are they responsible for? Beheading and capturing innocent civilians. And he tells this incredible story about Al-Qaeda strapping a 14-year-old girl with Down syndrome and sending her into a pet market in Baghdad and blowing herself up. So many images there, you could be forgiven for being confused. Pet market, Down syndrome, etc. And he says, this, you're trying to tell me that people like that are the moral equivalent of people like Ismail Bier. You can't make equivalences between these two. It is of no interest to anyone to this day that that was an invented story. Go look it up on the net. You probably still find it circulating as a real story. But it was a story invented by the US military, and they have acknowledged it, that they invented it and circulated it. But it circulates in our Canadian court, and that's important to know, because Kenney is circulating it in order to say that this type of people are beyond redemption. Now, it's very easy to see the geopolitical context underpinning all of this, and this kind of practice of telling these wild stories in my field, it's known as tabloid realism. You tell your stories like you're the tabloid press, very sensationalist stories. But these stories, this tabloid method, is a pedagogy. And it teaches us that Muslims are a depraved lot. And against these images, it's really impossible to consider Khadr as someone who deserves rights. Now, tabloid realism presents the depraved Muslim, but also the civilized European. And at these moments in the committee, you have people appearing before the committee making an argument for how civil Europeans are. So you have Howard Anglin, a Canadian lawyer working in Washington, appearing before the committee and saying that now we're in a type of war that is not as civil as World War II. Can you imagine? The historians in the room would have just fallen off their chairs. World War II was a civil affair. 15 million Europeans, they killed each other in that. And nevertheless, this is a story, and he tells a story that that was a war where there were gentlemen, whereas this is a war where there are no gentlemen. Khadr is not a gentleman. In the midst of all of this, it's not very easy to interrupt this flow of images. I want to just, before I move on to my final point, mention the role of brown witnesses in this kind of scenario, because there are brown people who really quickly realize which side you should be on. Otherwise, you yourself are imperiled. So that committee hears from Naresh Raghubir, the only brown witness who comes before the subcommittee, representing a group called Canadian Coalition for Democracies. Look it up. It's a strong anti-Muslim politics, a strong Hindu right connection. The group supports India's right to Kashmir, for example, and a pro-Israel stance. And he comes forward to the committee as a brown person who knows about brown people. And he conveys it all by using the word shahid for martyr, even though he's not Muslim and he's not a scholar of Islam and he doesn't speak Arabic. The committee accepts that he must know something about brown people, and his line is taken verbatim without a single word missed from Jason Kenney's line. I want to mention this because this too we have to think about when we think of anti-brown racism. We have to think about how we used against each other. So let me go to my final sort of site where we learn this pedagogy, and this is also involving Khadr, because I think we have to think about this site very strongly. So Canadians, as I've been saying, we pride ourselves on the fact that we had something to do with the protocol on child soldiers. You know how we say we're great peacekeepers? Well, we also say that we're behind some of the best human rights legislation in the world, and one of them is the protocol on child soldiers, which says very clearly that child soldiers are people you should treat as children. And so child soldiers have always featured strongly in the Canadian imagination. And when children go to school, they learn about child soldiers. Now, scholars have been very critical of this focus on the child because the focus on the child takes it out of its context. So if you can't see any of the adults, you can't see the actual nature of the crisis. So you may be familiar with child activists like Craig Kielburger and Free the Children. So we're very fond of these figures in Canada because they tell a story of third world children who are abused, but they're not children like Khadr. So it is no surprise that when Canadian school children go to the classroom and they have to learn about child soldiers, what is it that they learn? So they're presented with scenarios in which they're encouraged to imagine themselves as living in an African country in a hut where there's a lot of civil war and unrest, and they're trying to imagine what it is like to be taken up as a child soldier and swept away. The lesson plan, encourages them to empathize with the child soldier, think about the difficulties of reintegrating into the village if you're a child soldier in Sierra Leone. We can imagine the difficulties when the lesson plan has to deal with Omar Khadr. Because when it does, and it does deal with Omar Khadr, it doesn't deal with Air India, but it does deal with Omar Khadr, the plan doesn't ask children to imagine themselves in Khadr's position. Since the student is assumed to be white and in a position to save African children, Khadr's case as a child from a suburb in Toronto would be absolutely beyond their imagination. It would surely be a pedagogical feat for white school children to think that their own country could refuse to support them. Instead, the children are invited to discuss whether or not Khadr is a child soldier at all, and why Canada is resisting his return. It is highly unlikely that Canadian schoolchildren can negotiate the treacherous waters of monster terrorists when they think about children's rights. So these kinds of human rights discourses of saving the children have this built-in civilizational line that really can't cope with those stains on the landscape, those people internal to Canada who are not really Canadians. The civilizational line that we see here entirely obscures the violence of the West. We can't see it at all in this story of human rights saviors. And so, as in the school lessons, prepared by Free the Children who've done it, Canadians really, as a whole, really need a lot of pedagogical help to begin to see brown people as members of the nation. Khadr really haunts the nation, and he continues to haunt the nation. He represents the dangerous possibility that we have been uncivilized ourselves as a nation. We have acquiesced to the lawless zones of Guantanamo where torture was permitted. We have rendered people to torture. We have abandoned a child to his fate, but we keep all of this at bay by keeping in our heads that there are legitimate children to be saved. Through all of this, white Canadians come to understand their own racial superiority. It is an important question for us in this room to understand, to think about how we come to understand our own superiority in relationship to this landscape of excluded bodies, even if we might share something with those excluded bodies. I want to then conclude that throughout the pre-bombing and the post-bombing responses and the inquiry, there has been this absolutely consistent pursuit of innocence by the Canadian state. The idea that if anything went wrong, it's only because people were not prepared, or they were bumbling, or they didn't know the right thing to do. There has been no pursuit at all of how this terrible chain of events has occurred in a structure in which superiority is built in. Racial superiority is absolutely built in. And so when I hear the responses of families, and there are many in the room, and I will say to you as a scholar just reading the narratives, I sometimes am very overwhelmed by how gentle the critiques really are. People actually note that they weren't treated well, but very few people actually come right out and say, you don't think I'm the same kind of human as others. When I read those things and I track what I see as the racial fault line that runs through them, I have to ask myself, what would it take for us all to name this as racism? Why name it as racism? Why not keep trying to articulate that we are persistently scripted as outsiders to this nation, and that is a very bad thing for the nation as well as for ourselves, because that means you have a nation that will not take responsibility for its implications in blood feuds, its implications in the death of others. And so that's really what I wanted to invite you to think about, even as you navigate the intense pain of remembering those lives lost so needlessly, for nothing, remembering all of that we need to think about these ongoing structures and what it would take to interrupt them. Thank you.